That evening the little roadside bar was alive in its own way. The jukebox was playing an old rock song that everyone seemed to know, even though no one was really listening. Glasses clinked, pool balls cracked against each other, and the smell of beer and fried food filled the air. It was the kind of place where people came not just to drink, but to forget the world outside. Most of the people inside were regulars. They knew each other's faces, if not names, and they shared the comfort of routine. Some came after work, still in dusty boots. Others rolled in with loud motorcycles, wearing leather vests covered in patches. The sound of engines earlier in the night had made half the bar turn their heads, but no one thought much of it. A group of bikers arriving together was nothing unusual. They weren't all bad people, some of them just like the image, the brotherhood, the roar of the road. But when alcohol mixed with pride, the line between fun and trouble often blurred. Tonight was one of those nights. Laughter was a little too loud, and jokes were starting to cut a little deeper than they should have. At the far end of the room, one of the bikers leaned against the counter, his drink half empty, eyes darting around for something or someone to make his entertainment. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't exactly looking for peace either. Sometimes a man like that just wanted to remind the room he was the loudest presence there. The door creaked open and shifted the mood slightly. A woman walked in, not flashy, not trying to grab anyone's attention, but somehow she did anyway. Her steps were calm, steady, like she was used to carrying herself without needing approval. She didn't look scared, and she didn't look like she was here to impress anyone either. That quiet confidence was enough to make a few heads turn. She ordered a simple drink and found a spot, not in the corner, but not right in the center either. She wasn't hiding, yet she wasn't trying to be the focus. But in a place where people thrived on loudness and show, someone quiet often stood out even more. A few of the bikers nudged each other and whispered. Their chuckles mixed with the hum of the jukebox. To them, she was an easy target for a joke, a way to spark laughter among themselves. That was the way it often went in places like this. Someone picked out the different person and tested how far they could go. The bar carried on with its noise, but an undercurrent was building. It was the kind of shift you don't notice until later, when you think back and realize the room had started leaning toward a moment, like everything was waiting for one choice to tip it over. The woman didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, but she didn't let it show. She sipped her drink slowly, her eyes calm, her posture relaxed. Around her, voices rose and fell, some friendly, some sharp, but she stayed steady. One of the bikers, the same one who had been searching the room for amusement, finally pushed away from the counter. His boots hit the floor with heavy thuds as he walked, his smirk already forming. His buddies watched, some with grins, others with hesitation, but no one moved to stop him. That was the kind of silence that spoke loudly, the kind where everyone wanted to see what would happen, even if they wouldn't admit it. The air inside shifted again. People kept talking, but a few eyes followed him as he made his way toward her. The woman hadn't looked up yet. She didn't flinch or brace herself, which only seemed to encourage him more. The first part of the night had been all noise and laughter, but now something else was creeping in. It wasn't danger yet, not exactly, but it was the uneasy pause before it. That moment when you realize the story of the night is about to take a turn. And in that bar, on that night, everyone was about to remember what silence really felt like. The biker's shadow stretched across the floor as he stepped closer to her table. The jukebox kept playing, but somehow the music felt quieter, like the whole bar was secretly tuning in to this one moment. A few people sipped their drinks slower, pretending not to watch, while others openly turned their heads, waiting to see what would happen. The woman didn't move right away. She kept her calm posture, one hand resting lightly on her glass. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steady, not sharp or fearful, just steady, like she had seen men like him before. That look made him pause for half a second, but pride pushed him forward. He leaned down toward her, trying to make his presence heavy, like his size alone could push her into discomfort. "What brings someone like you in here?" he asked with a grin that wasn't friendly at all. She didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as though she was measuring more than just his words. Then she gave the simplest reply, same as everyone else. "A quiet drink. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly. Maybe because the room had grown so still. That calmness, instead of rattling her, seemed to rattle him. He laughed too quickly, a laugh meant to cover his own unease. Quiet drink. In this place? You picked the wrong bar for quiet. His friends laughed from the corner, encouraging him, but there was something in her expression, no smile, no frown, just that unshaken calm that made his attempt at humor land flat. The crowd was still half engaged, waiting for a spark that hadn't arrived yet. He wanted to prove himself now, to the woman, to his friends, and maybe even to himself. "You're too stiff," he said, his grin tightening. "People in here like to loosen up." And then, in a reckless moment fueled by drink and pride, he reached forward, tugging sharply at the fabric near her shoulder. The sudden sound of tearing cloth snapped through the air like a whip. The room froze. No one laughed this time. Even his friends' grins slipped away as the reality of what he'd just done sank in. The woman didn't jump, didn't shout, didn't push him away. She just sat there, her shirt pulled down far enough to expose her back, for a breath. The silence was heavier than any music or noise could have been. Then eyes widened, one by one, as the tattoo came into view. It wasn't small or decorative, it stretched across her back in intricate detail, each line carved deep into the skin by ink and memory. At first glance, it looked like a bold design, but those who stared long enough began to recognize it. Some saw the symbol first, a crest tied to service, honor, and sacrifice. Others caught the words inked below it, names etched carefully like a list that wasn't random, names that meant something far deeper. A few men in the bar had served themselves, and their expressions shifted immediately from curiosity to respect, then to something closer to shame. The biker who had torn her shirt stood frozen, his smirk gone, replaced by a kind of blankness. His hand dropped back to his side slowly, as though he'd touched fire without realizing it. He had been trying to humiliate her, but instead he'd revealed something no one in that bar had expected. The woman still hadn't spoken. She didn't need to. She straightened in her chair, letting the tattoo be seen fully. The room was so quiet that the sound of ice dropping in a glass at the far end of the counter made heads turn. People who had never cared much about her presence a few minutes ago were now staring with an odd mix of respect, guilt, and discomfort. The biker's friends shifted uneasily, some lowering their heads, others glancing at the door as though they suddenly wanted to leave. The fun had been drained from the night, replaced with a tension no one could laugh away. The woman finally picked up her glass again, taking a slow sip. She set it back down, her calmness unchanged. Then, in a voice soft but certain, she said, "Think before you touch what isn't yours." It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud, but it landed heavier than any shout could have. The biker, usually the loudest in any room, had nothing to say. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His face flushed, not with anger this time, but with embarrassment. He took a step back, then another, retreating toward his group, who were suddenly not so eager to stand by his side. The rest of the bar sat in stunned silence. People avoided each other's eyes, pretending to go back to their drinks, but the story was already etched into their memory. They had all witnessed something that would be talked about for weeks, maybe years. The tattoo was no longer just on her back, it was stamped in their minds, along with the lesson that came with it. The biker finally slumped back into his seat, his earlier pride completely gone. His friends whispered among themselves, but none of them dared approach her again. The noise in the bar slowly returned, but it wasn't the same kind of noise. It was quieter, more cautious, as though everyone had realized the weight of what respect truly meant. The woman, meanwhile, finished her drink without hurry. She didn't act like a victim, and she didn't act like a conqueror either. She was simply herself, calm, steady, and unshaken. When she stood to leave, no one stopped her. People made way without a word. Some nodded slightly, a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. The biker kept his eyes down, unable to meet hers. The door closed behind her, and only then did the bar release the breath it had been holding. Conversations restarted, but softer now, and every person inside carried the same thought. They had seen something unforgettable. That night, the biker lost more than just his pride. He lost the image of being the strongest man in the room. And the woman, without lifting a hand or raising her voice, reminded everyone what real strength looks like. Later, when people retold the story, they always started the same way. Remember the night in the bar, when the tattoo froze the whole place? And every time, the room would fall quiet again, because they all knew exactly what that silence had felt like. The silence in the bar hung like smoke, thick and heavy, even after the woman had left. People tried to return to their drinks, their laughter, their pool games, but something had shifted. The story of that tattoo was now imprinted on everyone's mind. The biker who had caused it all sat hunched over his glass. Just minutes earlier, he had been the loudest, most confident man in the room, his voice booming, his smirk pulling his friends along. Now he couldn't lift his head. His buddies avoided eye contact with him, but they didn't tease or laugh either. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't a source of entertainment, he was a source of shame. He took a sip of his drink, but even the burn of alcohol couldn't wash away the image of her back. The ink was still vivid in his memory. At first glance, it had seemed like nothing more than a bold piece of art, but the closer he looked, the more he saw. The emblem, the names, the sharp lines that weren't just ink, they were history. He didn't know her story, but he could feel it. Everyone in that bar could. That tattoo wasn't for show. It was carved out of loss, of sacrifice, of love for people no longer standing by her side. It wasn't the kind of tattoo you get on a wild weekend. It was the kind you carry for life, because it holds life inside it. He shifted uncomfortably on his stool, and the stool squeaked loud enough to make a few heads turn. Embarrassment flushed through him again. He was used to being the one who made others nervous, not the one who felt it himself. But tonight, he had crossed a line that left him standing in a spotlight of his own making. At another table, two older men whispered to each other. They weren't part of the biker crowd, just quiet regulars who usually came in after work. One of them had served in the military years ago, and he had recognized the emblem immediately. His whisper carried more weight than the loudest laugh in the room. That wasn't just a tattoo. That was a memorial. The words spread quickly, passed from table to table, until the meaning reached every corner of the bar. Heads nodded quietly, faces grew more serious, and the shame hanging over the biker grew heavier. He hadn't just torn a shirt. He had exposed something sacred. His friends shifted uncomfortably, the energy between them broken. Normally, they fed off each other's boldness, cheering one another on. But now no one wanted to be connected to what he had done. One of them muttered, "Man, you went too far." It was quiet, but it cut deep. The biker clenched his jaw. Pride told him to defend himself, to laugh it off, to say it was just a joke. But the look on everyone's faces told him he couldn't. No joke could erase what they had seen. At the far end of the counter, the bartender wiped glasses without saying much. He had seen a lot over the years: fights, tears, celebrations, but this was different. He watched the biker carefully, waiting to see if he would make another mistake or if the weight of silence would keep him seated. Finally, the biker slammed back the rest of his drink and set the glass down harder than he meant to. The sound echoed louder than usual, making a few people flinch. He muttered something under his breath, but no one asked him to repeat it. His pride was cracked, and no one wanted to see it shatter further. A few minutes later, he stood up, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. For a moment, everyone thought he might chase after the woman or try to reclaim his authority. But instead, he walked toward the door, his shoulders stiff, his steps uneven. He didn't look back. His friends hesitated, then slowly followed him out, one by one, until the bar felt lighter without their presence. But the weight of what had happened didn't leave. The story lingered in the air, growing stronger in whispers. Some people asked each other if they had recognized the names on her back. A few swore they did. One man said his cousin's name had been there, and he went quiet after that, staring into his drink. What struck everyone wasn't just the tattoo itself, but the way the woman had carried it. She hadn't shouted, hadn't raised her hand, hadn't fought back the way some expected. Instead, she let silence do the talking. That silence had been louder than any fight could have been. As the night stretched on, the bar tried to return to normal. The jukebox played another song, people clinked glasses again, and the pool game picked up where it had left off. But the energy was different now, more respectful, more careful. Every person knew they had been part of something that would be told and retold. And as the hours passed, people began shaping the story in their minds. Some exaggerated the moment, claiming they had seen the biker nearly tremble. Others swore the entire bar had gone silent for a full 5 minutes, though no one had timed it. But no matter how they told it, one detail always remained. The tattoo. It was more than ink. It was a reminder that everyone carries a story, often invisible, until the wrong hand tries to strip it away. The bartender closed up late that night, sweeping the floor as the last customers left. He paused for a moment at the table where the woman had sat. The empty glass still had a ring of condensation on the wood. He shook his head slowly, almost smiling. "That's one for the books," he muttered to himself. He knew he would be hearing about it for years to come. And he also knew that the biker, wherever he was, would never forget the silence of that bar. That frozen moment lingered in the bar long after the woman had walked out. The air felt thick, like the silence itself had weight. Even the jukebox seemed out of place now, its cheerful rock tune clashing with the mood that hung heavy in the room. People weren't just drinking anymore, they were thinking. The tattoo wasn't just an image. It had pulled everyone into a story they hadn't expected. Each person had seen something different in it. Some saw the emblem first, bold and undeniable. Others locked onto the list of names etched beneath it. And though no one had spoken the full story aloud, the meaning was clear enough. Those names weren't random. They belonged to people who were gone. One man near the counter, an older regular with lines etched into his face, kept staring at his glass. He hadn't said a word since the woman left, but inside, the memory of his own service years stirred. He knew the emblem, had worn it once himself, and his chest tightened at the sight of it. He whispered a single name from the tattoo under his breath, one he recognized. No one heard him, but his eyes grew wet, and he quickly looked down at another table. Two young men who had laughed earlier sat awkwardly, the grins long gone from their faces. They replayed the moment in their heads, and shame flushed their cheeks. They hadn't done anything, hadn't said anything, but they realized they had encouraged the biker by watching. That silence of complicity burned them now. The biker himself had slipped out into the night with his friends, but his absence didn't erase the tension he had left behind. People could still feel the echo of his act, and more importantly, they could feel the power of the woman's reaction, or rather, the lack of one. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out. She had sat there, calm, letting her tattoo speak louder than any words could have. That kind of strength unsettled people, because it was harder to fight silence than noise. The bartender, who had seen countless scuffles and heated arguments over the years, leaned against the counter for a moment, polishing a glass in slow circles. He didn't usually think much about the dramas that played out in his bar. They came and went like storms, but this felt different. He knew the story would outlast the night. People would remember not the drink specials or the music, but the silence. That deep, bone-level silence, when everyone in the room realized they were staring at something bigger than themselves. One of the pool players broke the quiet first, not with a loud word, but with a soft one. "She didn't even flinch," he said, shaking his head slowly. His friend nodded, chalking the cue absent-mindedly. "I've never seen anything like that." The words spread like ripples across the room, pulling people back into conversation. Some nodded in agreement, others muttered thoughts about respect, and a few just stared into their glasses, lost in thought. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just the tattoo, it was the way it had frozen them. It had forced everyone to stop, to see the woman not as a stranger, not as a target, but as someone carrying a story carved into her very skin. And in that pause, people felt something unusual for a bar so often filled with bravado and noise. Humility. Outside, the night carried on as usual. Cars passed on the highway, the neon sign buzzed faintly, and a few bikers who hadn't been inside revved their engines before speeding away. But inside, the room felt like it had been carved into memory. Even the younger crowd, who normally forgot nights like this in the blur of drinks and laughter, knew this one would stick. They would tell it again and again, maybe not perfectly, maybe adding details that weren't quite true, but always with the same core, the tattoo that froze an entire bar. The frozen moment wasn't just silence, it was a mirror. It showed the bikers their arrogance, the regulars their complicity, and the woman's unshakable calm. Some people left that night feeling smaller, others left feeling humbled, but no one left unchanged. The bartender eventually rang the bell for last call, his voice steady but softer than usual. People lined up for their final drinks, still quieter than on most nights. Even the sound of glasses sliding across the counter felt subdued, as if no one wanted to disturb the echo of what they'd witnessed. As chairs scraped and footsteps shuffled toward the door, conversations circled back to her. Who was she? Where had she come from? Did anyone know her story? A few speculated she had served herself. Others thought she carried the memory of someone she'd lost. No one had the full truth, but everyone agreed on one thing. Her silence had been the loudest sound they'd ever heard in that bar. And so the story began to grow before the night was even over. It spread from table to table, from whispered conversations to promises of retelling it later. Someone said, "We'll be talking about this for years." And he was right, because stories like that don't fade. They root themselves in the memory of a place, becoming part of its legend. The bar would never be just a bar again. It would be the bar where the tattoo froze the entire room. The days after that night, the story traveled faster than anyone expected. People who hadn't even been inside the bar spoke about it as if they had seen it themselves. The biker tore her shirt, and the whole place froze, they'd say. But the detail everyone always leaned on wasn't the act itself, it was the tattoo. Some folks described it as a bold piece of art, others as a memorial. The truth was, no one knew for certain, and that uncertainty only made the whispers grow louder. At first, it was just a story of embarrassment, the biker humiliated, the woman unshaken. But soon, curiosity grew stronger. What did the tattoo really mean? Who were the names etched into her skin? And why did it silence a room full of rowdy people who thought they feared nothing? One man who had served years before couldn't get the image out of his head. He sat on his porch the next morning, staring into his coffee, replaying the scene. He recognized the emblem. He remembered the feeling of wearing the same crest stitched into his uniform. And when he thought of the names, his heart tightened. He knew some of them, or at least thought he did. He didn't speak about it much, but that night brought back memories he'd long tried to bury. In his mind, the tattoo wasn't just art. It was a list of brothers and sisters who never made it back. He told a neighbor that wasn't a decoration. That was a living memory. Others had their own interpretations. A woman who worked in the diner down the road swore she had seen one of the names before, on a local memorial plaque by the courthouse. She told her co-workers that tattoo wasn't for show. It was for love. She must have lost someone. The whispers carried through the town like wind, picking up strength with each retelling. Some believed she had been a soldier herself. Others thought she was a sister or a wife of someone who had fallen. The truth remained hidden, but the respect grew regardless. People who had laughed at the story in the first telling now grew quiet when the tattoo came up. The details blurred, but the feeling stayed sharp. Meanwhile, the biker who had started it all couldn't escape the weight of it. His friends tried to shrug it off, but he knew the look in their eyes. They blamed him for what they'd seen. And worse, he blamed himself. Each time he closed his eyes, the tattoo reappeared, vivid and unforgiving. He hadn't just embarrassed a stranger. He had torn into something sacred. For the woman, the tattoo had always been more than ink. Each line told a story. Each name carried a weight. She had sat through the pain of the needle not because she wanted to show the world, but because she needed to carry them with her. Some people carry grief in silence, others in pictures or old letters. She carried hers on her skin. Every time she looked in the mirror, she didn't see herself alone. She saw the faces she once knew, the voices she once heard. The tattoo wasn't a wound, it was a promise. A promise not to forget, not to let the world forget either. That night in the bar, when her shirt tore and the tattoo was revealed, she hadn't panicked. She hadn't shouted, because deep down she knew there was no shame in what was on her back. If anything, it was the opposite. She carried the people she loved, the ones she lost, and no careless act could take that away from her. The silence that followed had been unexpected. Even for her, she thought there might be laughter, maybe cruel jokes, but instead there was respect, maybe guilt, too. And in that moment, she realized something. Her tattoo had spoken louder than she ever could. Back at the bar, the regulars couldn't stop replaying the image. Even days later, they found themselves lowering their voices when talking about it. They weren't just gossiping anymore, they were honoring something. Even if they didn't fully understand it, one man said, "It felt like a piece of history walked in that night." Another replied, "No, it felt like a piece of loss." Everyone carried their own version of the truth, but all versions carried respect. The tattoo had done what no amount of shouting, fighting, or preaching ever could. It humbled people. It reminded them that behind every stranger's face was a story, sometimes heavier than anyone could see at first glance, and maybe that was the real power of it. Not just the emblem, not just the names, but the way it forced people to look past their own noise. For the woman, life carried on. She didn't chase the whispers, didn't care to correct the stories people told. The tattoo was hers, and hers alone. What mattered wasn't whether people understood the exact details, it was that they felt its weight. The biker, though, carried it differently. Each time he walked back into that bar, he felt the stares. People didn't tease him openly, but the silence was worse. They remembered, and so did he. No drink could drown it, no laugh could erase it. He had tried to take her dignity that night, but instead he had been stripped of his own, and so the story lived on. Not in newspapers or headlines, but in quiet conversations, in whispers between friends, in the respectful nods of those who had been there. The tattoo was more than ink. It was a story, a memory, a lesson. And for everyone who had seen it, it became a reminder: you never know what weight someone else is carrying until the moment it is revealed. The bar was never quite the same after that night. On the surface, nothing looked different. The neon sign still buzzed in the window, casting its familiar glow on the gravel parking lot. The jukebox still cycled through the same rock songs it had played for years. The smell of beer and fried food lingered as always, and the old wood floor still creaked under the weight of heavy boots. But to those who had been inside that night, the place carried a new kind of silence, a silence that lived beneath the noise. At first, people didn't talk about it much. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they didn't know how to put it into words. But when they did talk, it was never loud, always in hushed tones, always with that same weight in their voices. "You remember the night she came in?" someone would ask, and heads would nod slowly, as if they all shared a secret that couldn't be shouted. The biker who had caused it all tried to return to his old ways. He came back to the bar a week later with the same crew, leather vest on, his laugh louder than it needed to be. But the air had shifted. His friends still sat with him, but they didn't cheer as much when he cracked a joke. They didn't push him forward the way they used to. Instead, they gave each other uneasy looks when his voice carried too far. He felt it. The respect he once commanded so easily had drained away. No one challenged him, no one called him out directly, but he knew. The silence around him was louder than any confrontation. He was no longer the man people looked toward, he was the man people remembered for crossing a line. It ate at him in small ways. He found himself drinking quicker, talking faster, trying to fill the gaps with noise. But noise couldn't cover the truth. That night had branded him as surely as the tattoo had branded her. Meanwhile, the regulars began to carry themselves differently. The men who had once laughed at crass jokes now found themselves biting their tongues. The women who had rolled their eyes at the bikers' antics now found space to breathe a little easier. The bartender noticed it most of all. He had worked behind that counter long enough to sense the rhythm of the place, and he could tell the rhythm had slowed, steadied. He told his wife one evening, "It's like the whole place grew up overnight." The truth was, the bar had been humbled. For years it had been a stage for noise, bravado, and careless pride. But the tattoo had cut through all of that, reminding everyone that life carried heavier things than their petty games. Even those who hadn't been there that night felt it. The story spread, carried on the wind of small-town gossip, growing stronger with each telling. Some swore the biker had nearly dropped to his knees in shame. Others claimed the entire jukebox had shut off the moment her tattoo was revealed. The details blurred, but the core remained. One act of disrespect had been silenced by a story inked into skin. And people listened. Soon, strangers who had only heard the tale came to the bar, curious to see the place where it happened. They asked quiet questions, hoping to catch someone who had been there. "Is it true?" they would ask, and the locals would nod, lowering their voices as if telling a ghost story. "True enough," they'd say, for the bartender. It was strange to see his little roadside joint turn into a place of legend. He had seen fights break out, romances begin and end, even the occasional wild stunt that people bragged about later. But none of those stories stuck like this one. This story wasn't about noise, it was about silence. And silence is a way of settling deeper. The woman herself didn't return, at least not in the weeks that followed. Some wondered if she ever would, but her presence lingered all the same. The stool she had sat on felt different to the regulars. The path she had walked to the door seemed etched into memory. She didn't need to come back, her story already lived there. One evening, as the sun set and the bar filled slowly, an older man stood by the counter with his beer in hand. He had been quiet most of his life, the kind who kept his head down. But that night, he finally spoke. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "that tattoo reminded me that we don't know a thing about people when we first see them. We don't know the weight they're carrying." Heads turned, listening. He continued, "That biker thought he was making a joke, but what he did was show all of us how little we pay attention. That woman, she carried her whole life on her back, and we didn't even notice until he tore it open. Makes you think." The bar grew quiet again, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully. People nodded, some staring at their drinks, others staring off into the distance. It wasn't just about the woman anymore, it was about themselves, about the unseen stories they passed every day without acknowledging. And in that moment, the transformation of the bar became clear. It wasn't just a place to drink anymore. It had become a place of memory, of reflection, even of respect. The biker, sitting in the corner that night, heard the old man's words too. They stung, but they also settled into him. He realized no one was going to let him forget. And maybe, deep down, he didn't want to forget. The story wasn't just hers anymore, it was everyone's. The silence had woven itself into the fabric of the bar, changing the way people carried themselves, changing the way they looked at strangers, changing the way they measured respect. And though the neon lights still buzzed, and the jukebox still played, everyone knew the truth. The bar would never be the same. It had been transformed, not by a fight, not by violence, but by a tattoo that spoke louder than words. Time has a strange way of holding on to certain nights. Most bar stories fade after a few weeks, lost in the noise of new tales and louder laughs. But not this one. Months passed, and still, people spoke of the night the tattoo froze the bar. Some told it with wide eyes, others with lowered voices, but always with the same gravity. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a lesson, etched into memory like ink on skin. For those who had been there, the silence of that moment lingered. They could still feel it when they walked through the door. The same jukebox songs played, the same pool table sat in the corner, the same regulars shuffled in at dusk. But behind it all lived a shared knowing, a reminder of how quickly arrogance could crumble, and how strength sometimes shows itself without raising a voice. The biker's life was never quite the same. He didn't talk about that night, not even to his closest friends. But people noticed the change in him. His laugh was quieter now, less forced. He didn't swagger the way he once did. When women walked into the bar, he kept his distance, no longer treating them as props in his theater of pride. He still carried shame. Yes, but also something more. Respect. A respect that had been forced on him. But that eventually took root. He replayed the woman's calm expression again and again in his mind, trying to understand how she had faced him without anger, without fear. That silence had humbled him in a way no fistfight ever could. And though he'd never admit it out loud, he was grateful for it. For the regulars, the lesson grew over time. They began to see people differently. When a stranger walked in, they didn't just size them up or judge them at a glance. They remembered the tattoo and wondered, what story is this person carrying? They began to pause before laughing too loud at someone else's expense. They began to recognize that every person walking through those doors might have unseen scars. And slowly, the bar itself gained a new reputation. It was no longer just a rowdy stop on the roadside. Travelers who had heard the tale came looking for it, not because they expected to see the woman again, but because they wanted to stand in the place where the silence had fallen. They wanted to feel it for themselves, to soak in the legend. The bartender noticed the shift most of all. On slow nights, he would find himself glancing at the stool where she had once sat, remembering the weight of that evening. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he respected her more than anyone he'd ever served a drink to. She had changed his bar without lifting a hand, without saying more than a few words. And isn't that the lasting lesson? That strength doesn't always shout. That sometimes the most powerful voice is silence. That dignity can't be taken by force, it can only be revealed. The woman herself carried on with her life. She didn't seek out the whispers or the stories. She didn't need to. The tattoo was never meant for others, it was meant for her, for the people she carried with her, for the promises she refused to let fade. She walked through life with quiet confidence, not because she wanted to be noticed, but because she knew who she was. But what she left behind was bigger than her. That night reminded a whole town that every person carries a history, that respect matters, and that arrogance can be silenced without a single fist being raised. In time, the story settled into legend. Newcomers would hear it for the first time and ask, "Is it true?" And the old regulars would smile, not with humor, but with certainty. "True enough," they'd say. And then, inevitably, the room would grow quiet for a moment, as everyone remembered the weight of that silence. Years later, people would still recall it with the same clarity. Not the details of the drink she ordered, not the exact words spoken, not even the biker's name. Those things didn't matter. What mattered was the silence, the frozen air, the lesson that no one forgot. Because stories fade, but lessons live on. And the lesson of that night was simple. Respect is not optional. Dignity cannot be stripped away. And every person, no matter how ordinary they appear, may be carrying a story heavier than anyone realizes. The tattoo was not just ink. It was memory. It was grief. It was love. And it was strength. And for everyone in that bar, it became a reminder etched not into their skin, but into their hearts, that you never truly know the weight someone carries until the moment it is revealed.